Hey guys, the rubber drive ring in this old snowblower is completely worn out, so today we're going to replace it. I have an older video showing you how to do this job on an MTD snowblower with tracks. This video shows you how to do it on a wheeled model, and lucky for you, it's a much easier procedure. The first step is to bring the machine inside where it's nice and warm because it's freezing out. The best time to do this procedure would be in the spring when you're already doing your yearly maintenance. That way you can do it in the middle of an oil change so there's no gas or oil in the machine and nothing to leak out. Then when you're done, you can add fresh oil but leave the tank empty and you'll be ready to go next year. Alright, let's get to it. So to get started, I'm going to tip the machine up on its front mouth so I have easier access to the drivetrain. Once the machine is tipped up like this, you have easy access to the drivetrain area. Most of these bottom covers come off with either 4 or 6 bolts. They're not bolted on very tight, so they come right off. Now starting from the top, you can pull the cover right off. So this is the drive ring, and this one is extremely worn down, so it definitely has to be replaced. So the way this works is this disc is connected to the motor and spins with the motor, and this disc is connected to the wheels. Now when you pull the drive lever, it squishes these two together so they both spin together. The gear ratios come from moving the shift lever that moves this wheel back and forth across the aluminum disc, and wherever it is on the aluminum disc, that's where you get a gear ratio from. And if you go past the center to the other side, now it's going to spin the other way, so that's how you get reverse. Drivetrains like this are extremely common. Almost every snowblower has them. Some of the really high-end ones might have a different system, but most things have this. If your machine's not too old and rusty, you can probably do this without removing the wheels, but they come right off, so I'm just going to remove them anyway. So we need to disconnect this center axle piece separate from the drive axle. So it has nuts and bolts on each side, so you need 2 wrenches so it doesn't just spin in your hand. The bolt on this side came right out, but the nut on this side is a little stiffer. So I'm going to use this giant wrench to hold on to this little mini axle, and then hopefully I can unscrew the other side. The bearings on this side of the mini axle are stuck. This probably won't happen on newer machines, but this machine is very old and rusty. Taking that off is a little bit outside the scope of this video, but I'm going to leave it in anyway because this could happen to you, so I'm going to show you how I removed it. At first glance, it looks like some kind of locking washer that's locked on there, but those splines you're seeing are actually the gears on that side of the axle. I tried hammering it for a while and that did not work at all, and I don't recommend it because it started to deform the axle. So what you should do in this situation is what I ultimately ended up doing to remove the bearings, and that is get a small gear puller, and that will let you pull the bearing right off. So in this video, it takes me about a minute to use the gear puller a few times to get the bearing completely off. But in real life, it took about a day. It was a lot of hard work, and I wasn't sure the gear puller would actually do it or if the arms of the puller would break. But in the end, it worked, and this was definitely the safer way to do this without damaging the machine. If you end up in this situation yourself and you don't have a small gear puller, I would suggest either buying one or you could try to rent one. I know AutoZone rents out tools for free. That would be better than trying to hammer it. I spent a lot of time hammering it before I switched to the gear puller, and the hammering was a mistake. With the nut, bolt, and bearings removed, you can now pull this mini axle right out of the machine. I'm going to go work on it on the workbench. They're not usually this dirty, so I'm going to give this one a quick cleaning so none of this dirt ends up on the new drive ring or on the aluminum friction disc. Now I'm going to take the disc apart so I can get the rubber ring off. These are all slightly different. I've seen some of them that have 4 bolts on the same side. This one has 3 bolts on the front that are going to be very easy to remove with a socket wrench. Then it has 3 bolts on the back that are a lot harder to access, so I'm going to have to use a small box wrench to take those off, and it's going to take a little bit longer. These bolts are on pretty tight, and it's hard to get good leverage on this small disc, so I'm going to put the disc back on the axle, and I'm going to hold the axle tightly with an adjustable wrench. Now if the wheel doesn't fall right apart, you can get a small flathead screwdriver and gently pry it apart. Here we go. All right. This is the ring. You can see how worn out the old one is. It's completely flat. All right, now I'm going to reassemble it. So the rubber goes right on the first disc, and then the second disc sandwiches it together. Now there's 6 holes on each disc. Half of them are threaded and half of them are not. So you have to line them up properly so that the non-threaded holes match up with a threaded hole on the other side. Because these 3 bolts go through this disc and screw into the back one. And then the opposite is the case here. They go through this disc and screw into the back one. Now you won't have to worry about this if all of the bolts on your ring are on the same side of the ring. So I'm just going to line it up right with that. And I'm going to try to make sure that the rubber ring is as centered as I can get it. It's going to get kind of squished into place, but just to get it started, I want to make sure it's even and balanced. Now I'll put the first 3 bolts back in. If your drive wheel only has bolts on one side, then you're done putting it back together. If it has bolts on both sides, like this one, then you have to flip it over and put the other bolts in. Bolts on the same side as the bearing are a lot harder to get in because the bearing itself is in the way and you can't use a socket wrench, so you have to use a small box wrench. It's a much slower process putting these bolts on, but it's not really that hard. You just have to be a little patient. So remember that bearing that was stuck on earlier? Before I reassemble all of this, I'm going to get some fine grit sandpaper and sand the inside of that bearing to get all the rust out of there. That way it should slide on and off the axle easily again like it's supposed to. Alright, the inside of the bearing is shiny clean metal again, and it slides on the axle a lot easier. So in the process of taking this all apart, a lot of dirt fell off and landed on the disc. And this aluminum disc is where the rubber ring we just replaced has to touch. And that friction is what makes the machine go. So I'm going to give this a good cleaning on the inside. I'm just using a paper towel with some acetone on it. Rubbing alcohol would also work good. Any cleaner that's not going to leave a residue. So even glass cleaner would probably work well. Okay, now I'm going to put the wheel back on the shaft. The shaft does need to be greased, but we'll do that later. When you're putting this on, make sure you have it oriented the right way. If you flipped the wheel around, it would not work inside the machine. So make sure you're reassembling the same way you disassembled it. Now I'm going to grease the ends of the shaft where the bearings go. Now you slide the axle into the machine. The gear selector arm has a pin on it, and you insert that pin into the hole on the bearing that's right next to the rubber ring. If your machine has any kind of steering, then you probably have more gears than this one has. Once you have it in position, you can put the bearings in on each side to hold it in place. Now reinstall the bolt, and then on the other side the nut that hold that axle in place. You want to use the adjustable wrench again to hold the axle in place so it doesn't rotate. Alright, the new friction wheel is rotating freely. It's turning the axle like it should, and adjusting the shift lever moves it back and forth just like it should. I'm going to put the wheels back on now because it's going to make it easier to spin the axle and grease the gears in the next step.
It's nice and tight. Okay, what I'm going to do next, I think you should be doing every single spring when you change the oil in your machine, which is I'm going to grease up the gears. This only has one set of gears. A lot of machines have two sets of gears. And I'm going to grease up this bar so that this piece can slide back and forth a lot easier. And the whole time I'm doing that, I'm being careful not to drip any grease onto this friction plate, because if that happens, the machine won't move. You can use something like WD-40, but the problem is it's going to evaporate really quickly and then it's going to not be lubricated anymore. So I'm using thick marine grease, and I'm just going to slather it on all the contact parts, and it should stay in place for a long time. All right, now it slides back and forth really easily. With all that grease on there, the more I rotate it, the more it's kind of spreading it evenly on all the teeth. But you can already feel a huge difference with how smooth it rotates. Before you put everything back together, it's probably a good idea to make sure you didn't get any lubrication on this disc.
To put the cover back on, start with the side of the cover that's closest to the front of the snowblower. Then slide in the other side of the cover that's near the back of the machine. Ah, my iPhone failed me. This whole clip is out of focus. But still, you can see what's going on. I'm just tightening the 6 bolts. Don't tighten these too tight because they're threaded into some very thin metal, and it's very easy to strip them by tightening them too tight, but you also don't want them so loose that they're going to fall out from the vibration when the machine is running.
All right, let's take the machine outside and see how it works.
Alright, this is a successful test. The machine's driving really nicely. I'm fighting it a little bit side to side only because this machine does not have any kind of power steering, but it's driving great and it's not slipping at all. So these rubber rings generally last around 5 to 10 years, but it really depends on how often you use the machine. Like I mentioned earlier, I would suggest you check the state of this ring once a year while you're doing other regular maintenance like lubricating the gears and changing the oil. If the rubber's getting worn down or if chunks of it are missing, then it's time to replace it, and they're not very expensive either. Anyway, if you like this video and you found it useful, please please like and subscribe. And if you want to see me actually use a snowblower to move snow, stay tuned for next winter. We'll see if the snow drought in Greater Boston finally comes to an end. See you guys later.